Imagine discovering your wife's affair with the man handling your company's finances, just as a tax audit threatens everything you've built. What happened next tested me in ways I never expected. Running my own business had been my dream, but I never imagined it would come at such a cost. Between managing clients and traveling constantly, my life had become a balancing act between work and family. My wife, Emily, used to stay home with our kids, Ethan and Sophie, who are both in high school. But with how busy things had become, we decided it might be best for Emily to join the business. She took on a managerial role, helping out remotely and occasionally coming into the office when I was away on trips. It seemed perfect. She'd have a purpose, and I'd have someone I trusted running things while I was gone. To make life a little easier, we even hired a driver to take the kids to school and their activities. It felt like the best way to manage everything. Emily could focus on the business, I could focus on expanding it, and the kids would be taken care of. On the surface, everything was in order. But looking back, I realized there were cracks that I ignored, small signs that all was not as it seemed. At first, Emily would call and update me on everything happening at work while I was away, giving me a sense of security that everything was being handled. But over time, her updates became vague. She started mentioning meetings with Thomas, our company's financial advisor, more often. It didn't strike me as strange at first. Thomas had been with us for years, and he was excellent at his job. But as Emily spent more time working closely with him, I noticed that her focus seemed to shift. When I'd return from a trip, Emily would quickly transition to working from home, claiming it was easier for her to manage things remotely. She said she wanted to be close to the kids and keep things organized at home. I thought nothing of it, assuming she was juggling the responsibilities the best she could. But little by little, things just felt off. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, and I started feeling like a stranger in my own life. The distance between us was something I tried to brush off at first. Emily was more involved with the business than she'd ever been, so I told myself that maybe it was just stress from balancing work and family life. But soon, small changes in her behavior became harder to ignore. She used to be the first one to share her day with me, to fill me in on every little detail about the kids or the business. But now, whenever I'd ask her about work, she'd give vague answers and quickly change the subject. I'd ask about the meetings she'd had with Thomas, our financial advisor, who had become more of her go-to than mine, but she'd just laugh it off, saying he was keeping everything in line while I was away. One day, I returned home from a business trip a day earlier than expected. I was exhausted but eager to surprise Emily and the kids. When I walked through the door, I found the house oddly quiet, no Emily working in her usual spot, no kids in the living room. I checked my phone and saw a message from Ethan saying they were out with friends for the evening. Then I noticed a faint sound coming from the office upstairs. As I climbed the stairs, I recognized Emily's voice. She was on the phone, speaking in a tone I hadn't heard before, soft, almost flirtatious. I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt for eavesdropping, but something kept me there, listening. I couldn't make out every word, but phrases like, "our time together," and "next time I see you," struck me like a blow to the chest. A pit started forming in my stomach, but I forced myself to stay calm. I convinced myself it could be nothing, that maybe I was tired, reading too much into things. When she hung up, I made my presence known, calling her name and pretending I'd just come home. She seemed startled but quickly masked it with a smile, hugging me and asking about my trip. The whole moment felt off, though, like she was relieved to have ended the call just in time. After that night, a nagging suspicion settled in. It was hard to ignore the growing feeling that something was happening behind my back, something Emily wasn't telling me. I didn't know if it was paranoia or intuition, but either way, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The following days felt heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Emily's late-night calls and vague responses than just work. Every time she'd mention Thomas in passing, something in her tone felt different, a little too comfortable, a little too familiar. The connection between them seemed to go beyond professional, and I knew I needed to find out the truth. One afternoon, Emily told me she was heading to the office to finalize some paperwork with Thomas. It struck me as odd because she'd been working remotely every time I was home. I decided this was my chance to follow up on my suspicions. After she left, I drove to the office, taking a back route to avoid being seen. I parked in a spot that gave me a clear view of the building without drawing attention to myself. About 10 minutes later, I saw her pull into the parking lot, followed shortly by Thomas. They greeted each other warmly, too warmly for my comfort, before heading into the building together. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I waited, observing from a distance. An hour went by, then another, and still no sign of either of them leaving. When I finally saw them emerge, it was well past office hours, and they looked close. Thomas leaned in, saying something to her, and she laughed, a sound that used to be reserved for me. Then he placed a hand on her shoulder in a way that felt intimate, as if they were sharing something deeper than a work connection. I clenched the steering wheel, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal surge through me. This wasn't just in my head. Something was going on, and now I had seen it with my own eyes. That night, I didn't confront her. I needed to process what I'd seen, to think through my next steps carefully. As much as I wanted to burst into an accusation, I knew I needed more proof, something concrete, undeniable. The pain gnawed at me, but I was determined not to make a move until I had all the facts. And so I started planning, quietly, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. The following days were some of the longest I'd ever endured. Every moment around Emily felt like a test of patience, knowing what I'd seen, feeling the betrayal simmering beneath the surface, but keeping my suspicions under wraps. She acted like everything was normal, smiling at me, asking about my day, even planning family dinners like nothing was wrong. I began to wonder how long she'd been hiding this, how long she'd been lying to my face. I realized that if I was going to confront her, I needed undeniable proof. Something she couldn't explain away with a casual excuse. So, I did something I never thought I'd do, I went through her phone. When Emily went to bed one night, I stayed downstairs, waiting until I was sure she was asleep. I took her phone, my hands shaking as I opened her messages. I was nervous, knowing I might see something I could never unsee, but I couldn't turn back now. There were dozens of messages between her and Thomas, most of them coded in business language, but it didn't take long to find the truth hidden in their exchanges. There were late-night texts, messages full of inside jokes, and phrases that stung like salt on an open wound. One thread was unmistakable. They'd met at a hotel just last week, under the pretense of a business meeting. My heart sank as I read her message confirming the room number, followed by his response, "Looking forward to our meeting, don't be late." She replied with a winking emoji, something that felt so intimate, so personal, it made me feel sick. I felt my chest tighten, the realization hitting me like a blow. She had not only been lying but had planned everything so carefully, weaving a web of deception to cover her tracks. She'd turned something as sacred as our family business into a playground for an affair. I returned her phone and sat in the darkness, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on me. Part of me still hoped it wasn't true, that I'd somehow misinterpreted everything. But the messages were there, plain as day. That night, I lay awake, feeling the anger, the betrayal, and the sadness all tangled up inside me. I knew that soon, I would have to confront her. I couldn't pretend any longer. Just as I was absorbing the harsh reality of Emily's betrayal, an urgent business trip came up. We were opening a new branch, and there was no one else who could handle the launch on such short notice. I barely had time to process everything, let alone confront her, but I knew the trip couldn't wait. Before leaving, I gathered the team, including Emily, for a quick meeting. I laid out the tasks that needed to be handled in my absence, my tone sharp and focused, masking the storm brewing underneath. I assigned Emily a set of responsibilities, watching her closely as she took notes with her usual efficiency. She looked calm and composed, as if nothing in her world had changed, while my entire view of her had been shattered. After the meeting, I pulled her aside. "I'll be out for the week. Make sure everything's handled properly while I'm gone," I said, my words coming out more clipped than I intended. Emily looked up, her eyes searching mine. "Of course," she replied with a smile. "You can trust me to keep everything on track." The irony of her words cut through me, but I forced myself to nod, biting back the anger. I couldn't give anything away, not yet. As I left, my mind was in turmoil. I hated the thought of leaving things unresolved, but I also knew that confronting her in a rush wouldn't give me the clarity I needed. This trip would give me some time to think, to decide how to handle things once I returned. And maybe, it would give her enough rope to hang herself, should she choose to betray me again in my absence. As the plane took off, I steeled myself, knowing that as soon as I got back, I would be confronting Emily with everything I'd discovered. And this time, I'd be ready. A few days into the trip, things at the new branch were finally starting to settle. I was busy coordinating teams, finalizing contracts, and making sure everything was running smoothly. Despite the intense workload, my mind kept drifting back to Emily and what I'd discovered. But with the constant demands of the branch opening, I hadn't yet found time to deal with it. Each morning, I had a routine call with the office back home to get updates and plan for the day. My secretary, Rachel, would handle these check-ins, giving me a rundown of progress and any issues that had come up. By day 3, I'd almost found comfort in the routine, but that day's call turned out to be anything but routine. As Rachel started her report, I could tell something was off. She sounded tense, her words clipped as she went over the previous day's activities. I listened, waiting for her to bring up the day's plan, but instead, she hesitated, as if unsure how to continue. "Is everything all right, Rachel?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. She took a deep breath. "Well, sir, there's been an issue in the finance department." The words hit me hard, and I immediately knew where this was going. "Go on," I said, keeping my voice calm, though my frustration was bubbling just beneath the surface. "It seems there was a miscalculation on a few reports, and, well, now we're facing a tax inspection." "They're coming in tomorrow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily was handling those reports with Thomas. I thought you'd want to know." I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle. This was beyond a mistake, this was reckless. And it was Emily's department that had made it happen. Whether or not it was intentional, she'd failed at one of the most crucial tasks in the business. "All right, Rachel," I replied, my voice sharper than usual. "Prepare all relevant documents and make sure everyone's ready to cooperate. I'll be back in a day to handle it myself." "Understood, sir." "We'll have everything ready for you," she replied, sounding relieved to have clear instructions. After hanging up, I sat back in my chair, the gravity of the situation settling over me. Emily had been entrusted with a key part of the business, and now, due to her lack of focus, or perhaps because of the distraction of her affair, she'd jeopardized everything I'd built. I couldn't ignore it any longer, I needed to confront both her betrayal and her incompetence, and soon. As I arranged my flight back, I felt a bitter sense of satisfaction knowing that she wouldn't be able to dodge responsibility this time. This wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore, she'd crossed a professional line as well, and now, she'd have to face the consequences. I arrived home at 4 a.m., exhausted but fueled by a simmering rage. The events of the past few days, the tax inspection, the sloppy work from the finance department, the constant deception, had all come together, leaving me with no doubt that I needed to confront Emily and put an end to the lies. I didn't expect her to be awake at this hour, and a part of me didn't care if I woke her. But as I walked through the dark, silent house, something felt off. I opened the bedroom door quietly, taking a step inside. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the faint glow of the hallway barely illuminated the room. I turned on a small light beside the bed, and there they were. Emily lay in bed, her head on the shoulder of none other than Thomas, our company's financial advisor, the very man who'd been causing chaos in my business. A surge of anger erupted from within me, and before I knew it, I was yelling. "What the hell are you two doing?" I shouted, my voice filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Both of them jolted awake, scrambling as if they'd been caught in a nightmare. Emily's face went pale, her eyes wide with panic, while Thomas leaped out of bed, fumbling to put on his clothes. I glared at him, feeling the heat of my anger coursing through every word. "Are you out of your mind, Thomas? This is my home. You're destroying my company's finances, and you think it's a good idea to go behind my back with my wife?" Thomas was stammering, his face flushed as he hurriedly buttoned up his shirt, his hands shaking. I didn't mean. I didn't think you'd be back so soon." "I bet you didn't," I cut him off. "But we'll talk more about this in the office today. Oh, and you might want to get your story straight because I'm done with the games." Thomas grabbed his jacket and practically ran out of the bedroom, his shoes in hand, slipping out of the house without another word. I could barely hear his footsteps as he bolted down the stairs and out the door. Once he was gone, I turned to Emily, who sat there frozen, a mixture of shame and shock on her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Emily," I said, my voice low but unyielding, "I have a lot to say to you. And trust me, you're going to listen." I turned to Emily, who was still sitting there in shock, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked like she was about to speak, but I cut her off before she had a chance. "Why are you just staring at me?" I snapped, my voice sharp and unyielding. "Everything's perfect at work, right? No issues, no mistakes in the finance department. Yet here you are, acting as if you've got all the time in the world to sleep with my colleagues." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked down, avoiding my gaze, which only fueled my anger more. "Did you think I'd never find out? I didn't leave for business so you could turn my absence into an invitation for this mess," I continued, my tone growing colder. "Do you have any idea what's happening at the office right now? Or are you too absorbed in your relationship with Thomas to care?" She looked up, a flicker of panic in her eyes. I didn't know. Didn't know. I scoffed. "We have an inspection today, Emily. A tax inspection, thanks to a mistake that came out of your department. I had to cut my trip short to fix this disaster, only to find you here, in our home, sleeping with the very man who's jeopardizing my business." She looked down again, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Didn't mean for it to go this far." I repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. "This isn't just some minor mistake, Emily. This is our life, our family, our business. And you threw it all away for what?" Silence filled the room as she sat there, visibly shaken, realizing the gravity of what she'd done. But I was done giving her time to process or make excuses. "Get dressed and get to the office," I ordered, my tone final. "You're going to explain yourself there. You've put everything on the line, and you're going to face the consequences head-on. And make no mistake, Emily, this isn't something you can just sweep under the rug." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to grasp the reality of the situation she'd created. Today, we'd face the fallout together, at the office, where everyone could see the damage she'd caused. By the time I arrived at the office, I was in no mood for pleasantries. I marched straight into the conference room, where my team was already assembled around the table, folders and laptops open, preparing for the day. Emily sat toward the end, trying to blend in, her face unreadable. Thomas was there too, looking even more uncomfortable than she was. But I ignored both of them, determined to get to the bottom of this mess before the inspection began. I took my seat at the head of the table, opening the folder that contained the financial reports, and immediately spotted the glaring error that had set everything in motion. Numbers that should have matched across the reports were wildly inconsistent, making it obvious to even the least experienced auditor that something was off. "Well, everyone," I said, my voice hard. "Let's go over the mistake in the documents." The room went quiet as I laid out the figures, my finger tracing each inconsistency. I could feel the tension rising, the nervous glances passing around the table. When I finished, I closed the folder with a thud and looked up, my gaze fixed on each person in turn. "This is a serious issue," I said, my tone steady but cold. "If this doesn't get resolved properly, we're going to court. And the consequences won't be pretty." I took a deep breath, keeping my anger in check for the moment. "Everyone, please leave the room. I need to speak with the finance department alone." The rest of the team filed out quickly, exchanging glances as they left, sensing the storm about to erupt. When the door finally closed, only Emily, Thomas, and the remaining finance staff were left in the room. I stood up, slamming my hands on the table as I looked around at each of them, letting my frustration spill over. "What are you all doing here?" I yelled, my voice echoing off the walls. "How could none of you notice this error in the documents? It's as plain as day. What are you getting paid for if you can't catch something this obvious?" The finance team members exchanged nervous looks, clearly shaken by my outburst. I turned to Thomas, who was visibly pale, his usual cocky demeanor gone. "And you, Thomas," I said, my voice dripping with anger. "This is your department. You're supposed to be handling these numbers, making sure everything is accurate. How did this get past you? Or were you too busy with other distractions?" Thomas stammered, unable to meet my eyes. I don't know how it slipped through, sir. I'll fix it. I promise." "You'll fix it?" I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. "I trusted you to oversee this department, and this is how you repay that trust. By letting my entire business risk collapse." I took a moment to compose myself, feeling the weight of the betrayal and incompetence pressing down on me. Then I turned to Emily, who was sitting in silence, her face pale, avoiding my gaze. "And you," I said, my voice softer but no less intense. "What were you doing while all of this was going on? Were you even looking at these reports, or were you too wrapped up in other things to care?" She looked up, her expression a mix of shame and fear. But I didn't give her a chance to respond. "From now on," I said, addressing both Emily and Thomas, "every report, every document, will go through me. I'll be the one to check it. Because clearly, I can't trust anyone else in this room to do it." With that, I stood up, ending the meeting abruptly, leaving them to sit in the silence of the mess they'd created. The day of the audit arrived, bringing a tense silence that settled over the entire office. I stood in the conference room alongside Thomas, the head of finance, and the inspectors. They were stern, no-nonsense professionals, flipping through our files with laser focus. Emily was nowhere to be seen, and that was just as well. I wanted her far from this disaster. I was here to protect what was left of my company, no matter what it took. As the audit began, it didn't take long for the inspectors to start uncovering issues. Small errors turned into glaring discrepancies, and by midday, they were finding things that weren't just mistakes, they were deliberate. Numbers that had been doctored, transactions hidden in a maze of complex figures. Thomas stood there, pale and sweating, as the inspectors continued to peel back layer after layer of deception. The head inspector looked up from the documents, his eyes hard. "There are clear indications here that someone intentionally manipulated these numbers. This isn't just negligence, this is fraud." The words hit me hard, but I kept my expression steady. I'd anticipated this, felt it coming, but hearing it out loud made everything more real. My company, the business I'd built from the ground up, was now mired in scandal, all thanks to the reckless actions of the very person I had trusted to handle my finances. The inspector continued, "Before this goes to court, we'll need all related documents prepared and ready. Given the scale of what we've found, this is heading straight to a legal trial." I nodded, maintaining my composure, though inside, I was seething. Understood. I'll have my legal team on it immediately. After the inspectors left, I called in my group of lawyers. We gathered in my office, going over every detail, every piece of evidence we would need to protect the company. As for Thomas, I felt no desire to shield him from the consequences of his actions. If he hadn't crossed a line by getting involved with Emily, I might have fought to protect him, to keep this from becoming a life-altering disaster for him. But that option was no longer on the table. He'd betrayed me on every possible level, and whatever punishment came his way, he'd earned it. One of my lawyers looked up after reviewing the initial findings. We can likely salvage the company, but we'll need to separate ourselves entirely from Thomas and his team. Any involvement with him at this stage would put us at greater risk. That's exactly what I want, I replied, my voice cold and final. Do whatever it takes to save the business. As for Thomas, he's on his own. Let him deal with whatever's coming his way. It was a brutal decision, but one I knew was necessary. Thomas had betrayed my trust, betrayed my family, and now he betrayed the company. He'd stepped so far over the line that there was no coming back, and I was done giving him any more chances. With a final nod to my lawyers, I knew I was ready to face whatever came next. The company would survive, of that, I'd make sure. And as for Thomas, I'd let the courts decide his fate. The trial stretched over an exhausting month, each day filled with revelations that shook me to my core. My focus had been on salvaging the company, but as the case unfolded, it became clear just how deep the deception ran. The investigation revealed a tangled web of scams, all orchestrated by Thomas with help from two others, my wife, Emily, and another employee from the finance department, a man I'd barely paid attention to until now. I watched in quiet disbelief as piece by piece, the full extent of their betrayal was laid bare in court. Thomas hadn't just made a mistake in the documents. He'd been siphoning funds through complex schemes, falsifying numbers to make it look like everything balanced. Emily, it turned out, had assisted him, signing off on documents without oversight and keeping his actions hidden from me, all while pretending to be dedicated to our family in the business. The third employee, a quiet accountant, had been involved in covering up the discrepancies, providing the technical expertise to mask the fraud. The courtroom was tense, and each revelation left me feeling both anger and relief. The company had nearly crumbled because of their selfishness and greed, and now, finally, they were facing the consequences. My team of lawyers fought relentlessly to prove that I'd been unaware of their actions and had taken every measure to rectify the issues as soon as they came to light. By the end of the trial, the company was declared stable, saved from collapse, and cleared of liability thanks to my swift actions. As for the verdicts, justice was served in full. Thomas, the orchestrator of the scheme and the man who'd turned my business, and my life, upside down, was handed the harshest sentence. The judge ordered him to serve time in prison for embezzlement and fraud, his reputation destroyed, his career over. Watching him being led away in handcuffs, I felt a strange sense of closure. He'd betrayed my trust on every level, and now he'd pay for it. Emily, my wife, the woman I'd trusted to stand by me, to care for our family and support my business, was given a suspended sentence and a ban on working in finance. She'd face no jail time, but her name was tarnished, and she'd lost the career she tried to build on lies. The judge's decision was merciful, but the ban from finance ensured that she'd never be in a position to make these mistakes again. The reality of her actions and the consequences she'd brought upon herself weighed heavily on her as she stood there, accepting her sentence. The third employee, the accountant, received a similar suspended sentence and a ban, his own career in ruins. As the final gavel struck and the trial ended, a wave of relief washed over me. The company was saved, my life's work protected from the recklessness of those who'd betrayed me. And while Emily had managed to avoid jail, I knew our marriage was over. Her choices had left a mark that I couldn't forgive, and the life we'd built was irreparably broken. Leaving the courthouse, I felt strangely liberated. The weight of the lies, the deceit, and the months of tension had finally lifted. I had survived the storm, rebuilt my business, and freed myself from those who had tried to tear it all down. Now, I was ready to move forward, with the strength of knowing that, despite everything, I had come out on the other side stronger and wiser. I barely had time to catch my breath after the fraud trial before I found myself facing the next chapter, the divorce proceedings. After everything Emily had done, her betrayal, her involvement in the scheme, her lies, I knew there was no going back. This was the final step in severing all ties with the person she'd become, and I was more than ready to close this chapter of my life. Thankfully, things were straightforward. We'd signed a prenuptial agreement before we got married, which made the division of assets crystal clear. She wasn't entitled to much beyond a few personal belongings, and given her suspended sentence, she knew better than to try for anything more. There was no room for negotiation or manipulation here. The part that mattered most to me, though, was securing custody of our children. They'd been through enough uncertainty, and I wanted to ensure they had a stable, secure home. Emily's actions, and her legal troubles, had made it impossible for her to provide that. I filed for full custody, confident that the court would see it was the best option for the kids. As the divorce trial began, it was almost surreal how quickly things progressed. The judge reviewed the prenuptial agreement, nodding as the terms were laid out. Emily didn't contest anything, perhaps she knew she had no grounds to stand on, or maybe she understood that her actions had left her with no real options. Her suspended sentence had put her on a very short leash, one misstep, and she'd lose everything. When the issue of custody was raised, the judge looked at me, his gaze assessing. I laid out my case, explaining that I could provide a stable home environment and had been the primary financial provider. With Emily's recent legal troubles and the suspended sentence hanging over her, the judge agreed. I was granted full custody of our children, the guardianship finalized then and there. In just a short span of time, the divorce was approved, and custody was granted in my favor. It felt like a whirlwind, but the ease of the process made one thing clear: I had already won. I had my business, my children, and my integrity intact. Everything Emily had once threatened to destroy was now back under my protection, safe from her deceit. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The trials were over, and I could finally look forward, leaving the weight of betrayal behind me. My focus was now on building a new life for myself and my kids, one rooted in trust, resilience, and the lessons learned from the past. With the trials behind me, I was finally able to focus on what mattered most: my children and rebuilding the life that Emily and Thomas had nearly destroyed. The journey hadn't been easy, but the worst was over. Thomas was serving his time in prison, facing the consequences of his greed and deceit, and Emily, with her suspended sentence, had little to fall back on. She was a shell of the person she once was, left to scrape by, having lost her reputation, her career, and her family. The kids had been shaken by everything, and I could see how much they were affected at first. Ethan became quieter, more introspective, while Sophie, always the more sensitive one, had frequent questions that I answered as best as I could. But with time, things began to settle. I made sure our home was a safe space where they could express themselves freely, and I focused on bringing stability back into their lives. Their routines of school, sports, and activities gradually resumed, and with each passing day, I could see a bit of their carefree spirit returning. As for the company, it was a slow but steady climb to restore its former reputation. We implemented new financial protocols and hired a dedicated team to ensure that no one could ever abuse their position like Thomas had. With renewed focus and hard work, the business started to thrive again. Clients returned, reassured by the integrity we'd worked so hard to rebuild, and I felt a sense of pride knowing that my efforts to protect what I'd built were paying off. In the quiet moments, I reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the heartache, it had all been painful, but in the end, it had pushed me to grow stronger, to reevaluate my life and what I truly valued. My children and I had come through the storm, and now, as we rebuilt together, there was a renewed sense of purpose in our lives. Slowly, life regained its rhythm. The kids were happy, the company was flourishing, and the shadow of the past faded a little more each day. I could finally look to the future with hope, knowing that we were free from the toxicity that had once held us back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. We had survived, and from the ashes of betrayal, we were building something far more resilient and true. The future felt brighter, and as I watched my kids laughing, carefree once more, I knew that this was the life I'd been fighting for all along.